increase total investment above the ASEAN 6 average, we have the President of the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines to formally introduce the panel as well as a guest speaker. Everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Gunter Taus.
Good morning, everyone. I stay right on stage. Distinguished guests and friends of Arangkada, I'll be introducing the first panel, the increase of total investment above ASEAN 6 average. This panel is being asked to identify bold strategies for the Philippines to reach a much higher gross capital formation, or in short, GCF, ratio to GDP, including $15 billion of foreign direct investment per annum to be achieved within a decade. That's indeed a target that's much easier said than done, but it's an essential target to create much needed jobs, and jobs is what we need in order to move forward. Currently, the GCF ratio in the Philippines is 19.5%, but for the other ASEAN 6 economies, it is closer to about 30%, so we are severely lagging behind. Thus, the target for the Philippines should be to raise it to 30% by the year 2026. Also, if you look around, we see dozens of cranes and construction sites and new buildings all over Metro Manila, but we don't see the same level of activities anywhere else in the country, especially when it comes to agribusiness and manufacturing plant. And why not? The Philippines is receiving more FDI, averaging to about $6 billion each for the last 2 consecutive years. This is great news considering how low it was in the past. But the other ASEAN 6 economies are receiving much more. For instance, Vietnam, a record of $14.5 billion in 2015, and Indonesia, around about $25 billion in 2015 also. So we ask our panel to advise us what should be done in order to perform as well as Vietnam and Indonesia, and to increase annual FDI inflow to the Philippines by 2.5 times, from $6 billion to $15 billion within a decade. Well, having said that, let us now call up on the stage our speakers, panelists, and moderators. First, our 2 speakers. I was just informed that Dr. Manny Esquerra, a socioeconomic planning secretary, is unfortunately not here, so we have to miss out on him. The second one will be Dr. Bobby De Ocampo, OBE, who has so generously graced our fora 4 times, for which we are deeply grateful and appreciative. We have printed a summary of his past policy recommendations in this year's Arangkada assessment. For our first distinguished panelist is our 2014 Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, no less than PESA Director General Lilia de Lima. We are among her biggest fans for her red carpet treatment for investors, and she has been attending all, and I mean all, of our Arangkada fora, among others. Director General de Lima will be joined by Canadian Chamber President Julian Payne, who you have seen earlier, who will summarize bold reform recommendations for the underperforming mining sector, and Ms. Bayan Tienga, co-chair of the Agricultural Committee of AmCham, who will discuss bold reforms recommendations for a slow-growing agribusiness sector. And rounding up our panel is our moderator, and it's my pleasure to introduce Cathy. Usually she introduces me. So Ms. Cathy Young from our media sponsor, the ABS-CBN News Channel. I'm sure the audience is familiar with Cathy, who anchors 2 shows, Market Edge and Business Nightly. After the speakers are finished, they will join the panel, and we look forward to most interesting discussion led by Ms. Young. Thank you very much and good morning. May I call everybody on stage, please?
Everyone, apparently we are all meeting for the first time, and Miss Bayan has just come from a travel, no, that crisscrossed across Southeast Asia. So we're just coming around together. But this is a very welcome event for us because, well, personally as a journalist, I've really been wanting to know what the economic platforms are of our various presidential candidates. And today, I've been enlightened. And today, we will also be enlightened by investments. We will focus on investments because this is what we want to hear about. The kind of economic growth we're hoping for the next presidency will try to achieve. Good to see you again. I haven't seen Bobby for a long time since his days as finance secretary. Good to have you with us, Bob. And it's the kind of growth that we want to see, faster and inclusive growth concerning investments. The title, as this panel suggests, it is all about increasing total investment above the ASEAN 6 average. So we're becoming bolder in our goals here. How do we get to a much higher gross capital formation to the ratio of GDP, and how do we attract there's a figure here, $15 billion US. I mean, our panelists will tell us if that is a very aggressive target, only you would know, of foreign direct investments, 15 billion in foreign direct investments in 10 years. But first off, we will start with Bobby De Ocampo to give us a 15-minute address. Yes, please, if you could. Thank you, sir. On his thoughts about investments. He's been a fan as well of Arangkada, no? For the past 3 Arangkada sessions, you've been here, Bobby, and this will be your 4th. Please.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good morning to all of you. As Kathy said, I'm a Suki of Arangkada. I had spoken to you a number of times, and I thank you for the honor of asking me to speak again, even if you've asked me to speak for 15 minutes. Now, the topic you asked me to come up with is what steps could possibly be taken for us to move forward in the ASEAN. Now, that is a very tough thing to do in 15 minutes. It's like the tough choice I had to make last night as to whether I should watch the Oscars or The Walking Dead. And I opted for The Walking Dead. So you can imagine what's my mindset for this morning. I happened to catch the tail end of the early morning discussions. And as usual, one would expect that there are a lot of things that can be said and planned and promised and so forth. But at the end of the day, what matters is making up your mind and deciding. So, I listed a number of things in the 15 minutes that I'm speaking to you that form part of a longer list, because actually the long list has been presented and printed by Arangkada for 4 years now. And there are many things in the Arangkada list that have to be done and considered. Let me start. If you're looking at getting the Philippines moving, the first thing you have to think of is what positioning in the global competitiveness should the Philippines have? The second is where are you today, and is that a good enough takeoff platform to get moving forward? And finally, you figure out what are the key steps you have to put into place in order to move forward. Well, where we are today is an economy that is on the pillars of 2 things, OFW remittances and BPO. Obviously, if you want to go to ASEAN levels, the economy has to diversify beyond these 2. Because if you rely on just 2, then the economy is too dependent on just 2 items. You cannot get to more foreign direct investment, nor can you get to more inclusive growth if you don't pay attention to these 2. The foreign direct investment of the Philippines has gone up to about $5 billion, which is a bit better than it had been the previous years, but it is only 1/2 of the foreign direct investment of Vietnam, and 1/3 of the foreign direct investment now coming into places like Indonesia. And if I start rattling off other countries, you will get more and more depressed. Therefore, the question becomes, what does it take to get more foreign direct investment in here? The first, I think, was alluded to earlier. You have to have less restrictive foreign direct investment rules that limit the areas where foreign direct investment can come in. The Makati Business Club, and I'm happy that our chairman is here and can expound on this probably even more, has always espoused the position that constitutional amendments may have to be done in order for direct foreign investment to come in a bigger way than they're coming in today. Some like to say that no, you don't need it because we can do it by this and that. Okay, my answer to them is fine. If you think you can do it by this and that, will you please make up your mind and do it? Because Vietnam, for example, and Indonesia have done it. Vietnam has come up with a list of specific entities and sectors where foreign direct investment is now loosened up. Indonesia has been even more expansive about opening up to foreign direct investment. We cannot dilly-dally. If we can amend the Constitution in order to have foreign direct investments coming in a bigger way, as Makati Business Club and many of the private sector suggest, it not only is a step forward, it's a signal. What is important for the foreign direct investment to come in is to tell the world that we're really open. Not that we're maybe open, not that we're thinking about it, not that we are prepared to do it, but that we are going to do it, for goodness sake. Whether you do it by constitutional amendment or whether you're going to do it by what Vietnam did specifying, at least please get it done. Foreign direct investment will also stimulate domestic investment because there will be partnerships and so forth, and as a result, it will be a good step towards inclusive growth because inclusive growth means creating jobs. You cannot have a 7% GDP growth and have a lot of joblessness, or it will be jobless growth. Now, after you put this in place, it is also simultaneously important for us to decide the second thing, which is to organize investment magnets that would be attractive to foreign investors to park their businesses here. If you are sitting in EDSA for 1.5 hours of traffic for 8 kilometers of road that you are to traverse each day, you probably will think twice before you come to a place where it is faster to go to Hong Kong than it is to go from, let's say, San Juan to Makati. Therefore, this is not to be construed as a traffic problem. I think the problem right now is that everybody thinks it's a traffic problem, and therefore let's put the buses this way, let's put more flyovers. It's not. It is an urban congestion problem. And the only way to address an urban congestion problem is to decongest it. You decongest it by beginning to build communities outside of Manila. My own proposal is to get serious about an investment triangle that involves Subic, Clark, and Metro Manila. Transfer the airport to Clark. There is already a road connecting to Subic, and that Subic, Clark, Metro Manila triangle can be further reinforced by implementing MRT-7 as fast as you can. I'm not saying that because I was formerly the chairman of MRT-7, but if you've got a situation here where buses are just coming in and clogging up the roads, you need to have a decision to come up with an urban decongestion plan which involves moving the airport, having an alternate port facility, and having a decent transport system in Metro Manila. Then you've got an even larger area for people to consider investments, and you would have much more foreign direct investment coming in. I would say as well that we have to review the powers of MMDA. You probably have to give them a little more, because if you've got a population now in Metro Manila of 18 to 20 million people, and you're trying to fragment decision-making by having every little town and city being decided by individual mayors, it is a non-starter. Okay, next, PPP. Obviously, there is need for infrastructure. I said it several times before. I said infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. But you have to get moving with it. And one of my proposals for the PPP is to make the PPP Center a much more vibrant body by creating it in the manner that you have PEZA. It doesn't have to be a cabinet post, but it has to have the flexibility and the capability to decide and have people that understand engineering, business, and financial packaging in order to make decisions that take into account the absolute truth that you cannot get private business in here unless you have a decent rate of return. But if you start in the mentality of PPP that a decent rate of return means you're exploiting the poor people, and this is too high, and so you'll never make up your mind. So you need a PPP center, I think, that is professional in its assessment of projects and has as much flexibility and power as, say, PEZA. Look, PEZA's done a good job. I don't see why PPP center, headed properly, won't do a good job as well. Fourth, reorganize the cabinet. I think the DOT, the Department of Transport, should be merged with the Department of Public Highways. Put them together. At the same time, carve out the Department of Communication and then expand it to the Department of Communication and IT. There are those that are asking for a separate IT department. Yeah, I understand the importance of having IT. But I think looking ahead, most of communications will have to do with IT. So carve out Department of Communications, put it as Department of Communications and IT, and give it that much importance. Yes, we are in the BPO sector and so forth, but we continue to have the lowest broadband speeds. That has to be given enough attention. Fifth, agro-industry. We now have a situation where perhaps the old system of agrarian reform is going to be a thing of the past, but we have to take that platform in order to bring agriculture from subsistence to agro-industry. There are only a few ways to do that, and one of them is to come up with rules and regulations that allow for aggregation of land-reformed lands without, of course, disadvantaging the farmers. Without some kind of aggregation, you can't possibly think of 1.5 hectares of land being provided a loan for a grain dryer or a tractor. It just doesn't happen. And if we continue on the same path of we are in agrarian reform, you will keep fragmenting. The time has come to think of aggregation rather than fragmentation and turn our agriculture into an agro-industry base. Well, next, tourism. Some of the stuff that I said about infrastructure, of course, applies to tourism as well, but I have a suggestion that perhaps we can identify a place like Palawan and declare it a special tourist economic zone. You see, we've got in other countries around us, Langkawi, Jeju, Bali, and so forth on down the line. When you attract people to tourism, it is also good to have a concentrated magnet where the airline type of arrangements can be focused. And I think Palawan is a good place to do it. But it leads me to the next subject matter as well, which is mining. We must decide that mining is not a disaster for the Philippine economy. We must decide that there has to be a balance between mining and environmental protection. And that starts from identifying very precisely where those areas are that are good for mining. We can put conditions about people that come in for mining in terms of not being just an extractive industry, but also moving from extraction to processing. But for goodness sake, as I said, making a decision is better than just dilly-dallying and not giving the clear signal to foreign investors that you look at this as a resource that can be developed for an industrial base without the development of that resource, you will not be able to proceed to the next base of economic development and be able to produce more jobs, more growth for the country, and of course, much better opportunity for inclusive growth. 3 more, although I think I'm running out of the 15 minutes. Mindanao. I think we should go back and discuss not just peace processes, but a master plan. You have to have the people there engaged in the idea of how do you turn the place into a development magnet, because you have to have a combination of political and economic development to make the thing happen. And I believe that if people can seriously sit down and master plan the region and perhaps have some kind of a revival of the old idea that has been shelved of the BIMP, IAGA, things could possibly move forward in Mindanao in terms of combining a mentality of peace and economic development. Finally, number 9 in my list is the avoidance of excessive regulation and bureaucracy. I'm a kind of concern that there have been instances where the concept of good governance has been misapplied or misinterpreted to mean good governance means the production of endless regulations to second-guess the move of every businessman in order to make him behave properly. Well, there may be some parts of this that are worth thinking about, but let us not get to the point where we are regulating in order to get rid of common sense and good business judgment. I just give this as a kind of a warning. Specific details and so forth can be worked out by others, but I have this concern that we can all cheer about good governance and then start coming up with endless regulations and tax measures and so forth in the name of good governance, and we tie instead the hands of business to move forward. And finally, tax reform. I have always been, you cannot finance this without adequate revenues, but I've always been, even as Secretary of Finance, a proponent of expanding the tax base and not just creating new taxes. I would gamble on a much more rational tax system. In other words, reform the present one, lower the direct income taxation, lower the corporate tax, apply a stricter administrative measure on VAT, and then put into place those other things I mentioned, like the magnets, Subic Clark, in order that you'll have areas of investment in manufacturing and foreign direct investment, which widen and broaden your tax base and therefore allow you to collect more revenue without coming up with more and more tax measures that would make the country non-competitive. So those are my thoughts for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby. I think you just gave the next administration a whole list of homework to do. A lot really stems from the goal of increasing investments, hindi ho ba, Bobby? Kaya that's the reason why we had you speak. And that was a really long list there. And the thing that, yes, really caught my attention is you mentioned amend the Constitution. In the first 100 days of the new presidency, what do you think the new leader should do to allow for more foreign investments, increase foreign investments to a level that we hadn't seen above ASEAN 6 average?
I think the new leader should immediately convene a LEDAC and make it an intrinsic part of administrative practice to have the LEDAC convene on a regular basis. Because if you're going to do something as important and delicate as amending the Constitution, you have to have a buy-in from different branches of government, particularly, since it's an amendment of the Constitution, the legislative branch. But you see, if you're not articulating if you're not leading the way to point at a vision and then getting everybody involved in that vision, then you don't even get to square one. So for me, the first practical step is to call a LEDAC and have a signal that there is a long-term vision for the country. It includes this important part of it, and we as an entire country, to executive and legislative branch, are going to work together to get it done.
So it's a sort of signaling that you want for the first 100 days for foreign investors to see that something is being done to open the Philippines.
Definitely. Messages that are of an active manner are more impressive and clear than endless speeches and words about how things can get better and so forth. But if people see that you're acting to get it done, if people see that you're articulating a vision beyond your term of where the Philippines ought to be in X year, 10 years from now, and how to get there. Like we're saying this morning, how do we put our country at least at par with ASEAN averages? No, you cannot do it overnight. So you have to have a target date when you're going to do it, and you have to have a specific set of target items that you're going to put into place. You cannot do everything at once, but you have to have targets that are best suited to giving you a fighting chance.
Well, we do have one case study here in the panel. I'd like to cite PEZA. Bobby did make a mention of PEZA, and DG De Lima is in our panel today. And before anything else, I think you congratulations are in order because you've just celebrated your 21st year on February 25th. A very big milestone. Please give a round of applause. You've achieved so much. I've seen the numbers. In fact, I had to highlight them because it looked really incredible here. 3.1 billion achieved and paid taxes. Trillion. In fact, it's trillion. I should correct myself. It's 3.1 trillion PEZA investments, 50.5% over the last 5 years. That's inclusive of 2010 to 2015. You've achieved a lot. But how do you achieve the next step of growth, DG De Lima? What do you want the next administration to bring to get that aligned with your own goals of growing faster at PEZA?
No, but before I answer that, Kathy, let me just explain. Of course, there are always constraints in government, but you must be innovative enough to address constraints. Like, for example, the Constitution. It could be better if there were amendments there.
What sort of amendments,
Before it is amended, we can have ideas on how to work within those constraints. Of course, our traffic is terrible. So how do we go about that? Then have ideas to work within those constraints. So what we did, for example, traffic is bad. If you're caught in the traffic jam or the truck ban, goods cannot move. So what did PEZA do? We instituted a non-stop shop. In other words, in the zones, we render service 24/7 because most of the companies render 24/7. So you heard of that. There are so many, having worked in the government this many years, of course there's always constraints, but it's up to us to be innovative, creative. For example, when the PEZA law was made, the general concept of economic zones is only manufacturing. But we saw the opportunity. The talk in 1990s was ICT. And so we said, the law says PEZA must develop industrial, commercial, banking, tourism, financial centers. So it doesn't just talk about industry. So we went into IT. Then we saw the need for tourism before the TSA law was passed. So we went into tourism. And much later, we saw the need for agro-industrial. There's a lot of opportunities for agro-industrial economic zones. We went to that. So we just have to work within the constraints, be innovative, and we can move forward. But of course, if the constraints are removed, then even better.
Which constraints in the first 100
Well,
days
you're
would you
talking
like
about-
removed if you had your way with the next leader?
You're talking about amending the Constitution. Of course, I was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. It's not easy to just amend. But as suggested earlier here, there could be amendments to certain laws which could maybe open up short of amending the Constitution. So these are some of the things that could be done. And we cannot just mope and say, oh, because this. Of course, there's so many problems. But we are very clear about our mandate. The mandate of PESA is to create pockets of development all over the country. We cannot do that just by manufacturing because you need ports, seaports, shipping, etc. We just had this tsunami, the port congestion, which was the cause of the decrease of investments inside PESA zones. We have another tsunami coming up, and I may share this with you. If we do not settle these chemicals, importation of chemicals, this will be very difficult for the manufacturing sector. Importation of chemicals because there's a lot of rules and regulations because of the threat of terrorism. But that should be balanced. That threat should be balanced between the economic needs or the needs of investors inside these economic zones. So of course, there's always conflicting, but it is up to us, the managers, to navigate this labyrinthian, I think that's too much, this maze, so that we can do our task. We just have to think, be innovative. Thank you.
It's an interesting word that you mentioned. I don't think that's in the vocabulary, but I totally understand what you mean. You had to be innovative to get around all the constraints. I'm glad you made a mention of agribusiness because in our panel, Bayan, you manage the agricultural sector. And I wanted to know how much progress there had been during the current administration the last 5 years. And from there, how can we vote to faster progress when it comes to agribusiness, because really agriculture makes up a big part of our economic growth, or the lack of it.
Thank you, Kathy. We all know that in the last few decades, the Philippine economy has transitioned rather, from being an agrarian economy to a services-based economy. But currently, the agrarian sector, agriculture sector rather, contributes a mere 10% to the GDP. And last year, it grew at a paltry 0.11% compared to the overall economy, which grew at 6%. Having said that, 1/3 of our workforce is employed in agriculture. That's 12 million people who depend on agriculture for their livelihood. A huge portion, 73% of the rural poor live in the provinces, and farmers and farm workers constitute a huge 38% of that number. Obviously, for the country to have some sort of an inclusive growth that we like to talk about, we have to take a very serious look at ourselves. And the American Chamber, together with the joint chambers, have conducted roundtable discussions with industry stakeholders. And we have identified some of these recommendations that we actually already gave 5 years ago. So we just want to sort of refile or refresh those recommendations that we think could still use a lot of improvement. So very briefly, I want to discuss a few of these things. Better market access, okay? The country stands at the cusp of an entirely new economic regime. We are looking at several free trade agreements. The TPP and the ASEAN economic community is fast coming up, and it offers a huge opportunity, a huge market that the Philippine agriculture products can compete in. But to do so, it must be competitive. The country has to invest seriously in R&D, and priority must be given because resources are scarce. Priority must be given to high-value crops like cacao, coffee, or marine products, tobacco, squash, and others. Okay? Secondly, access to finance. Normally, all these bankable projects or programs reside in large commercial enterprises. However, a lot of our farmers are very small, fragmented affairs. And the government needs to find a way to reduce the risk. And there is a huge need for a comprehensive crop insurance system that would mimic the scale of the conditional cash transfer. This is a very ambitious and a noble approach that we hope that the new leadership would take a look at. Okay? Resources are also needed to assess and apportion risk adequately, such as land, soil, and very recently, of course, we know that weather patterns have been changing, and radical changes in the weather have held farmers and even large companies hostage. Like our company suffered huge losses last year because of drought in a place that is normally rained at every day. So we need information, we need technical information to help farmers improve their lot. Freeing up the land. Okay. The land market. Today, there are so many untitled properties. Apparently, there are 11 million parcels of land that are currently untitled and therefore not productive. After 6 decades, land reform remains incomplete, and a lot of uncertainty still abounds with regards to ownership, etc., etc. The Chamber also recommends that limits on handholding and consolidation should be revisited and preferably lifted. And ways should be found to integrate small farmers into the larger enterprises. We have seen a lot of companies doing this successfully already. So Nestle and our own supplier, Universal, to mention a few. Infrastructure investments. Today, farm-to-market roads, only 3.5% of barangay roads are paved. Can you imagine that? And only 57% of irrigable lands are being irrigated. So there's a huge area for improvement that we can address. And these are low-hanging fruits. But we just need really huge investments in infrastructure. And post-harvest facilities such as cold storage, rice dryers, food processing facilities, etc., etc. And finally, rationalization of extension services. Today, there are almost 1,900 agencies and offices around the country that are tasked with implementing extension services for farmers. This happened in 1991 because of the devolution through the local government code. And such a huge number obviously needs rationalization. We believe the Department of Agriculture should reassert leadership, put some sense and order into this, and more importantly, to strengthen links to R&D and be able to use this position to share the information with the farmers. In sum, small farmers constitute the bulk of the poor in the country. Obviously, we need bold measures. Half-baked measures are not going to cut it. We need bold BHAG measures. And bottom line is to open up markets and to unleash the capital. Thank you.
So for the first 100 days, what would you like the new president to do? I mean, that's a long list, but pick one.
It's a dream list, but I think for us in the agriculture sector, the biggest dream that we would like to have really is for irrigation. We may need to revisit the mandates of the government offices and rationalize those as well. How to use water. I mean, that's it.
Thank you, Bayan. Julian, the experience in the mining sector is totally different because in the last couple of years, you've had the experience of the Tampakan mine issue that brought about and revealed the lack of direction, if you will, in the mining sector coming from a mining participant such as yourself. What then can be the boldest recommendation in the coming administration when you input the experience that you've had and the mining sector's had with the Tampakan mine?
Yes, thank you for the question. We're talking about how to increase foreign investment, and mining is one of the major areas where it could be increased. And just very quickly, what has stopped it? One has been a ban on mining,
It says
and it's just been
mining ban
declared
stays.
yesterday's paper.
Yesterday's paper.
The mining ban stays. The second thing is the proposed fiscal legislation, which will basically render mining internationally uncompetitive because we have a higher annual effective tax rate than virtually any other country. So if the ban doesn't stop mining, that will. The third thing, which is rather unfortunate and very sad, is that the Philippines has missed out on an era of very high mineral commodity prices and availability of investment because of a high return on investment, and is now facing a situation which is quite different and much more. What should we do? We need an administration that, first of all, declares mining as a development of the mining industry as a national priority for its own domestic security, for employment, and for tax revenue. Secondly, we need an administration which basically says, yes, we will update our fiscal regime, but in such a way that it doesn't exceed the average AETR for APEC so that we can remain internationally competitive. And the third thing we need to do is mining is a long-term investment. It takes 25 to 50 years to begin to get a real return on your investment. We absolutely need sanctity of mining contracts. We cannot say that mining contracts have to be renegotiated or changed unilaterally by the government in 15, 25 years. We need basically contracts for 50 years that can only be changed with the mutual agreement of both parties. These are the three things that are absolutely needed to get the increased foreign direct investment for the mining industry. There is one other point which I'd mention, a fourth. The local governments and the provinces who host mines have many expenses. They only get 40% of the revenue from mines, state revenue from mines right now, and often very, very late. If you want support of the local government units, the barangays, the provinces, you've got to give them an equitable, fair share of the revenue from mining, and you've got to do it expeditiously. I believe personally that some of the opposition to mining at the provincial and barangay level is frankly because they're not receiving the benefits. Thank you.
Which brings me back to Bobby, because I know repetitively you said in your 15-minute speech there seems to be a lack of political will, and this is what's needed to get things together. If we talk about a certain target here, and it's been stated here in this panel discussion, $15 billion US dollars of FDI in 10 years. Combine that with political will, do you think that that is an achievable target? Having been a public servant in previous years as a finance secretary, do you think that is achievable?
I think it can be exceeded. But
Exceeded by how much even?
Well, I can't give you how much, of course, but I think that the resource base of the Philippines is quite substantial compared to the resource base of many countries in ASEAN. I mean, there's no agriculture to speak of in Singapore. There's very little agriculture to speak of in Hong Kong and Japan. We've got that. You don't have any mining to talk about in some of these countries. We've got the resource. Now, the thing really is when you're trying to manage an economy to move forward, there are always balancing acts to take into account. But when you do this balancing act, you have to make sure that you stimulate the economy forward to make it grow, allow it to expand in order to be inclusive, and don't just focus on a number like 7% growth rate or wonderful ratings from rating agencies. Focus also on those items that are necessary in order to make your entire economy an engine for the entire country to move forward by the management, proper balance of resources, and by your always thinking that the country has to be in a competitive position vis-a-vis others. It cannot just keep looking inwards and having narrow targets per department of government, rather than looking at how the entire machinery can achieve an identified vision and purpose.
Great, and that wraps up our session. I'm just seeing there are 3 seconds to go. Thank you so much for joining us for that, the words of wisdom from our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Bobby De Ocampo, Bayen, DG De Lima, and Julian. Thank you so much. The next panel will talk about jobs and inclusive growth, so just hang in here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I request our panelists to please move a little bit forward for a souvenir photo. May I request our panelists to come forward for a souvenir photo, please. So thank you once again for everyone who participated in the first panel on increasing total investment. And now to introduce our guest speakers for the second panel entitled Reduce Unemployment and Underemployment to ASEAN 6 Average. Please welcome the President of the Philippine Association of Multinational Companies Regional Headquarters, Inc., Mr. Dan Moloy.
Guests and friends of Arangkada, this panel is being asked to identify bold policies to substantially reduce unemployment and underemployment. This is from a starting position of 5.6% in the Philippines today, with an underemployment rate of 17.7%. We've been at the highest level in the ASEAN 6 for many years now, which is currently at 4.3% unemployment. Since the Philippines has the highest population growth rate in the ASEAN 6, this may be particularly hard to achieve. But at the same time, the country's demographics should help via the demographic dividend. And frankly, we must challenge ourselves to sustainably create jobs, quality jobs, for the next decade to improve the lives of Filipino families without requiring workers to go abroad. To discuss this challenge, let me first introduce our speakers, panelists, and moderators to discuss what can be done to sustainably reduce unemployment and underemployment for the Philippines going forward. First, the Honorable Brother Armin Luistro, Secretary of Education, whom we asked to explain how the Philippine government can provide hard and soft educational infrastructure for a more capable future workforce. And then, Dr. Roger Vandenbrink from the World Bank to speak about relevant policy reforms for future growth, poverty reduction, and inclusivity. And then the balance of the panelists, including prominent businesswoman, Mrs. Doris Magsese Ho, a highly regarded civic and business leader who chaired the APEC Business Advisory Council in 2016. Doris can speak to the issues of OFWs, since her company is a world leader in providing maritime manpower. She will be joined by Undersecretary Janet Lopez, Executive Director of the Mindanao Development Authority, who can speak to the problem of poverty in parts of Mindanao where life expectancy is 10 years below the national average. And then Korean Chamber President Ho-ik Lee, who will summarize bold reform recommendations for the tourism sector. And then rounding out our panel, we have Mr. Peter Wallace, prominent business consultant, columnist, and Philippine citizen. Mr. Wallace recently wrote a column entitled "It's All About Jobs" in our media sponsor, the Philippine Daily Inquirer, providing his usual excellent policy prescriptions. After the speakers are finished, we will join the panel where we look forward to a most interesting discussion led by Mr. Wallace. Let's get started.
I think it's, before I speak, that Secretary Luistro should talk, and also World Bank, and then I will introduce the panel. So, Secretary.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this privilege to share with you from an educator's perspective issues that are very relevant not only for business people, but I think most especially for the coming elections. Never has unemployment undergone a drastic decline in the last 2 decades as it has now. You know this very well, from a staggering 13.9% unemployment rate in the first quarter of the year 2000 to a record-breaking low of 5.7% in the fourth quarter of 2015. We are witness to a very important milestone in the history of labor in the Philippines. But it may be too early to celebrate. The ASEAN 6 average of our close neighbors we have consistently remained on top with the highest unemployment alongside Indonesia since 2000 at the very least. Despite that dramatic drop to 5.7, in 2015, unemployment in our neighboring countries ranged from 0.9% to 3.1%. So our achievement pales apparently in comparison, and we are still a far cry from the rest of ASEAN 6. But there is a bright side. As has been predicted many years back, we have reached our demographic window, which is expected to last until 2050. 66.63 million people in the Philippines are at that productive age, from 15 to 64. That may slightly change with the implementation of K-12, since our students will be in school until age 18 at least. But 63.3% of our labor force and around 94.4% are employed. There is much to be done for the 5.6% who are unemployed, but perhaps even more for the 17.7% who are underemployed. And I'll speak a little bit more about this later. The importance of job creation cannot be undervalued, as you all very well know. And the reality is that this demographic dividend can only be capitalized if ample quality jobs for labor entrants are created and sustained. It's not surprising that our closest neighbors have attributed roughly a third of their economic growth to their entry into demographic transition, underpin significance of simultaneous rigorous institutional development, government policies, and market reforms. But from my perspective, education is still a key to the creation of a very strong workforce with appropriate skills and high market value if we want to bring in foreign direct investment. But in the 2015 data from the Philippine Statistics Authority, they show that more unemployed graduates than unemployed undergraduates in each of the educational attainment. This has not been discussed much. For example, of the 43.6% of unemployed individuals with high school as their highest educational attainment, 33.3% were high school graduates, and only 10.3% were high school undergraduates. Among the unemployed individuals with college as their highest educational attainment, which is 35.9%, 22.6% were college graduates, and only 13.3% were college undergraduates. There must be something wrong with the education of the rest. The enormous 17.7% underemployment rate is equally and perhaps even more disturbing. And therefore, it is important for us to keep looking at our educational system and how we intersect with the business sector. The Philippines, as you all know, has lagged behind our neighbors with for the longest time, 10 years of basic education program, and the many negative consequences that are part of that. Availability of economic opportunities are a factor to the high youth unemployment and underemployment, as well as the mismatch between what we teach in schools and what the industry needs. Our high school graduates, and only 56% of them are able to access higher education, after which many of the rest just stay as high school graduates. But they lack the basic competencies, skills, even for an important job in the market. In the global market, graduates of our 10-year basic education program are also at a great disadvantage. And some of them are not able to get into the next level or be promoted because of the requirement of the rest of the world. Obviously, from our perspective, what we need is an education reform and the need to bring to the fore a basic education curriculum that matches our skills with those that are required by industry. Our program, K-12 Reform, is set to stretch the goals of high school beyond just a preparatory for college, and to include now vocational and technical career opportunities, if not entrepreneurial opportunities for them to start a small business. The K-12 curriculum will introduce technical and vocational courses prescribed by the Philippine Qualifications Framework, which is currently already being aligned with the ASEAN Qualifications Framework. Our students will be allowed to specialize in a field of their choice: science, technology, music, arts, sports, agriculture, fisheries, to name a few. They can acquire a national certificate following their track, after which they are eligible to join the workforce or engage in an entrepreneurial endeavor, and hopefully lessen the number of unemployed or underemployed. In the middle of the global financial crisis in 2009, the Joint Foreign Chambers identified 7 areas of growth where the Philippines has a competitive advantage. Those are critical inputs for the education sector so that we can align our programs, but maybe also our scholarships, to those that are needed by industry. Unemployment, however, is just one of the concerns. The bigger concern is underemployment. At 17.7%, that will translate to more than 7 million of our population. And for those who are non-poor, the most important is for us to be able to provide them with more skills and competencies so that they will not be underemployed. The K-12 reform will hopefully trigger many other opportunities for these underemployed, 7% of our population, so that they may be able to access many other ways whereby they can increase their income and their productivity over the next few years. In the K-12 reform, our high school graduates may be able to access a national certificate level 2 from TESDA, and will allow them to professionalize whatever skills and competencies they may have learned in school. The Philippines will need to ensure that our positioning in ASEAN will continue to be competitive. And there is no other area for us to continue and sustain that reform except in education. I believe as we jumpstart our educational reform in the next 2 months, we will start by June this year. We hope that what we have started in the department as an important milestone will be supported by business. And we thank you for that wonderful memorandum of agreement that allowed many of our chambers to partner with the department, not only in ensuring that our graduates will be absorbed by business, but also that our curriculum will be very much in line with the needs of industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and good morning. My name is Roger Vandenbrink. I'm lead economist for the World Bank. I've been here now for 3.5 years, and it's been a good time, and I'll explain you a bit why. Can the first slide come up? I'm going to talk to you about the challenge of inclusive growth. You know, when administrations move from one to the other, we write these notes. We write notes for ourselves, and we write notes for the stakeholders, and we write notes for the new secretaries. And here's a selection of what I think personally would be some of the things I'd like to put on the desks of the secretaries as they take office July 1st. I'm going to talk about inclusive growth. And this is the challenge. It's more than growth. Growth may be necessary, but is not sufficient to ensure poverty reduction. How broadly based that growth is, how pro-poor the distribution of that growth is, also matters. And the key to this is raising the returns to labor, the main asset of the poor. And you do this by, first of all, increasing value added per worker in agriculture. That's where most people start. And then once peasants, farmers have some money in their pockets, have some health, have some education, then they move to the cities and find work in higher value-added activities in manufacturing and services. But next to how broadly based that growth is, it also matters how resilient the growth is and the extent to which the poor and vulnerable households are protected from shocks. To do that, you need to put in place an appropriate social protection scheme. And you need to raise the human capital endowments of the poor. But I said it's not sufficient growth for inclusive growth, but it does start with growth. And here's a graph that shows you how this country has done, comparing 3 decades, the 1990s, the 2000s, and then the period of the current government. And you look at these variables that we economists call the macroeconomic fundamentals. And this is a fantastic graph. On all accounts, the current account balance, the inflation rate, debt service as a percentage of GDP, international reserves, this looks like I've never seen before. This is my 12th country. I've never seen a graph like this. I usually are sent to countries where it goes the other way. But this is really extraordinary. Macroeconomic fundamentals, you can put a mark beside it and move on. There's also some good news about recent income growth if you compare the income growth per decile. So these are the income classes, the bottom 10, 20, 30, etc., up to 100. The Philippines also hasn't seen a graph like this in a long time because it shows that the income growth per decile between 2012 and 2014, that this has been definitely pro-poor. Now these are just 2 years, these are just 2 surveys. This is early days, yeah? But at least this has happened. If you go behind the reasons why this pro-poor pattern of growth has been achieved, and you look at the household data, it comes from the conditional cash transfer program. You have one of the biggest conditional cash transfer programs in the world today, and judging by this graph, it is pretty well targeted. The quality of jobs created is also getting better. If you look at job creation and you look at the formal employment as a share of that, the trend is up. But there's still a massive jobs challenge facing the poor. Unemployment is one variable to look at, and you define it to include workers who are without work but looking for work. Underemployment is defined to include all employed persons looking for more work. If you look at these graphs, the one on the left, you see that actually unemployment is a problem of the educated categories. It's almost like educated people can afford to stay home and wait for a job. The poor cannot afford to make a living. They have to find a job, and they have to create one for themselves if there's no one there. So that's why underemployment is the more relevant measure for the poor. And there you see definitely this underemployment issue is definitely skewed towards the bottom 40%. Why is this? We looked at how many job entrants came onto the market every year. So look at that circle in the top right corner and look at the green slice. Every year there's about 1.15 million new entrants into the job market. And we projected this forward. We did this calculation in 2012, and we said, what if the business process outsourcing sector kept growing at 20% a year, an astonishing rate? What if we could double manufacturing? Also quite a feat. Even with those assumptions, we could only find, out of the 1.15 million new job entrants, that 240,000 could find a formal job in those sectors. 200,000 would actually find a job overseas. 60,000 wouldn't find a job at all, and that left then 650,000 job entrants trying to make a living, trying to find a work for them somewhere in agriculture or in informal services. And if you look to the graph on the right, these are the poverty incidence rates. Various surveys, various methods, so don't get too confused if you take a particular year. We can have huge debates about the methodology, and sometimes these methodology changes within a series. But the overall trend is declining, but only slowly so. You can also see, by the way, if you look at the orange graph there, that these years between 2012, 2013, 2014, we had quite a sharp drop in poverty from 2012 to 2013, but then a slight uptick between 2013 and 2014, and I'll get back to that. But overall, poverty incidence is only very slowly declining, and it's related to this job challenge that the majority of the people face. Why is this? When I started this job, I of course read up. I read all the big analytical books and reports that people had written about the Philippines. Why this jobs challenge is with the Philippines is very well known. Paul Krugman wrote in 1992 already, the fundamental problem of the economy is its inability to create more and better jobs. The causes are also very well known. The causes are lack of competition, complex regulations, insecure property ownership, lack of investment, and they lead to low agricultural productivity, weak manufacturing sector. And the outcomes are there for all to see. High informality, high levels of poverty, and out-migration. Here are some of the policies that we think should be put on the desks of the next secretaries. And this is just a selection. First of all, let's start with agriculture. To get that inclusive growth really happening, you need to go back to agriculture again. Why is this? Many countries in the region have really done very well in terms of economic growth and poverty reduction by starting in agriculture. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China. China is the most famous one. And if you look at about 600 million people that were lifted out of poverty in China in the last decades, note that the first phase of that first 300 million people, their poverty was reduced through agricultural growth. Once Deng Xiaoping liberalized the farming sector, It said people, you don't have to work on collective farms anymore, and you can keep some of your produce for yourself. Millions of peasants started earning a bit more, and they spent this amount locally. It's typically spent locally, and that was the first phase of China's poverty reduction miracle. Only after that, the second phase was where manufacturing kicked in. Some manufacturing capacity had been created. It then linked up with international market, and you got this second lift. World Development Report on Agriculture in 2008 by the World Bank, it asked the question, so why is this so? And it shows that GDP growth originating in agriculture benefits more than growth in any other sector. Why is this? Very simply, if you raise farmers' agricultural profits, they have more money in their pockets. But it also raises non-farm profits and labor income via multipliers. First, the multipliers within the agricultural chain, but then these consumption linkages. They're very, very large. They also cause, or should cause, lower prices of food. So the consumption basket of the poor gets cheaper, and that leads to lower real wages in other sectors, which then grow faster. Philippines, this long history of policy distortions have slowed down the growth of agriculture and manufacturing in the 6 decades. Manufacturing has failed to grow sustainably, missing the labor-intensive manufacturing export boom of the 1980s and 1990s. And now low productivity, low-skill services have emerged as the dominant sectors of the economy. So the next administration really needs to take a hard look at agriculture and manufacturing. And let's start with one issue: rice policy reform. Rice prices in the region. In January 2015, 1 kg of rice cost 35 pesos in Philippine markets. In contrast, Thai and Vietnamese are paying the equivalent of 15 pesos. Imagine if rice prices would fall to international market prices in this country. The poor spent over 20% of expenditures on rice, 40% on food in total, 20% on rice. So if that price fell to the world price levels, it would be, by the stroke of a pen, an increase in the spending power of the poor by over 10%. And it's also, when I look at this graph, it makes you sad. If you look at malnutrition, stunting among children, these are data from 2011, and it compares the Philippines to other countries. And the region where you're in, and I've been in some of those countries, Nigeria, Guinea, Uganda, Djibouti, Cameroon, that's the neighborhood you're in. For a country of Philippines' average income level, that's a sad datum. High rice prices are also pushing up wages and reducing the competitiveness of other sectors. The share of food expenditure to total household consumption, if you compare the Philippines to the other countries in the region, is much, much higher, at 41.5%. The ratio of the minimum wage to value added per worker in the metropolitan area is very, very high. Look at the evolution of farm gate prices. Farm gate prices have increased much less than marketing costs. Rents, we think, are mostly captured by traders, not so much by farmers. And by the way, as you see, both in 2008 and in 2013-14, you see these upticks, these increases in the price of rice, which are so costly for the poor. That has to do with the rice policy that the country has at the moment. Its objectives have been for decades now self-sufficiency in the production of rice, but the performance says that there is a significant gap between production and consumption until today. The other policy objective is to buy high from farmers and sell low to the poor. These purchases and sales are too small to have a significant impact. Another objective was to stabilize the rice prices. Yes, but that stabilization has come at the cost of much higher rice prices. And you saw those spikes. Those spikes are basically caused by the state, because the state has the monopoly on rice, by the state being too late in the importation of rice. And that then results in very high spikes in rice prices. The other policy objective was to develop the rice marketing system. Now, the widening gap between farm gate and retail prices suggests increasing inefficiency. Let's move from rice to farmers. Remove the state's import monopoly and replace it with tariffs. Progressively reduce these tariffs over time. And then focus on farmers, increase the agricultural productivity of farmers, a very classic agricultural agenda that many countries in the world have successfully done many, many times. Invest in research and development, you heard it earlier, revamp agricultural extension, build rural infrastructure, roads, irrigation, and electrification, secure farmers' property rights. A lot of farmers in rural areas basically don't feel that they own their plot. Even under the Agrarian Reform Program, you find fathers scratching their heads, can I bequeath this farm to my son? That's the type of uncertainty that you really don't want to have. And improve farmers' health and education. Inclusive growth also needs a focus on SMEs. Small and medium enterprises account for most employment creations in East Asia and the Pacific, including here. But starting and maintaining a small business is still not easy. The number of procedures required to start a cooperative business in the Philippines stands at 16, barely improved, and is substantially higher compared to neighboring countries. As a result, this costs the country more than 100 billion pesos every year in opportunities forgone. In our economic update from October 2015, we go over this. Make it easier to do business. If you compare the strength of the legal institutions on the vertical axis and the complexity and cost of regulatory processes on the horizontal axis, you see that the Philippines is in the upper right corner. It needs to move to that lower left corner. But that's very difficult to do because many agencies and many spheres of government have an impact on this. You need a strong coalition across agencies and across these spheres of government. And here are just some of the potential reforms about starting a business, getting credit, getting construction permits, enforcing contracts. This ball needs to be put in the net as a team. This is not just dependent on one strong leader in one department. Need to focus on shipping. If you look at the international shipping performance, this is the 2014 Liner Shipping Connectivity Index. The Philippines is at the bottom of this neighborhood. And we do think the Philippines is ready for competition. A quarter of the world's seafarers is Filipino, and exports of skilled marine engineers are increasing. And Filipinos build and export ships now. Here you look at the last years and you see an increase in the gross tonnage and the market share of the Philippine shipbuilding sector. In July 2015, the President fortunately signed the Foreign Ships Co-Loading Act into law. This is also known as the Foreign Ships Co-Loading Act, This is a move in the right direction. Foreign ships can now load and unload imports and exports along domestic routes. This will help reduce costs for importers and exporters, and it will also aid in decongesting ports within the country. The Act specified that the implementing rules and regulations should have been promulgated by September 22, 2015, but we're still waiting. And reforms need to continue. Domestic shipping is still protected and maybe, according to some, not ready for competition. At the same time, ports, export processing zones, and transport infrastructure need to be much better planned and coordinated. We think that your domestic shipping companies can be regionally and internationally competitive, but they need to be allowed to combine overseas and domestic routes. And they need to have the local infrastructure, both on port sector and transportation sector, that can make this happen. Need to focus on labor market reform. Just one slide there. Over 70% of employees have at least one aspect of informality. Rotating people from company to company on 5-month contracts is prevalent. If you look at the graph below, you see that the real output per worker is the blue line. It has increased a lot, but average real wages have stayed flat. That means that their bargaining power is low. And it also might indicate a lack of competition between firms. Need more tax revenues. It was mentioned earlier by Sir Bobby. There's an investment deficit which needs to be funded through increased tax revenues. Yeah. The high corporate income tax, it's high, but the collection rate is very, very low. Let me move to the end. Can you move on? My chair is saying I have to stop. Further. Further. This is the fiscal space created. Further. 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 On transparency and accountability, next. The Philippines has released 3,500 data sets from 35 national government agencies. Over 680,000 unique users have used this. We urge you also to start using these platforms. And this open data principle is included in the proposed Freedom of Information Bill. The Philippine government electronic procurement system, 7 million records have been released. And some of these projects are geocoded. You can sit behind your desk, use Google Earth, and zoom in on the school or the road or the clinic. Further. 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 Pass the Freedom of Information Bill to lock in these dramatic improvements in transparency that have been achieved. Institutionalize open data. Institutionalize geocoding. By the way, adopt a single unique identifier for each budget item so that the budget can be tracked by officials and citizens alike, as a budget item moves from planning to procurement to disbursement to execution and auditing. So the what is well known, I told you. This is a list of policy reforms that are very well known among the people in this room and that have been with the country for decades. The how is the issue. Next. A change of administration. Next. A change of administration provides a unique window of opportunity. Its first 100 days, its first 6 months, its first year. But if you just pick a few reforms, say increased competition in a particular sector, it will face very strong opposition from vested interest. And that can sap the energy out of the reform process. The challenge really lies in fostering a broad coalition of stakeholders led by committed leaders, which supports a reform package for inclusive growth. Because the people that are part of this coalition anticipate that inclusive growth makes everybody better off in the long run, even if some will face losses in the short run. These coalitions can form at many levels, sectorally, regionally, and locally, and around many themes. This can be done, but it needs the stakeholders. It needs you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I agree with much of what Roger had said, and particularly on one thing, which is rice. And I wrote a column on this where I also pointed out that if we got rid of NFA and allowed the open market to exist, the price of rice would halve. And you would think that the government would take action on that. I had no response at all. Nothing. So people still pay double what they should for rice because the government won't act. We're talking about Labour today, but before we do, I must say a couple of points. I fully agree with Bobby, I generally do, on changing the Constitution to open up the economic sections. And I cannot understand Miro Kimbo or his boss, Ma Rojas, and their ad hoc solutions to getting much more investment into the country. I also agree on decongestion. I was in Pampanga last week giving a speech where I suggested to the Pampanga Business Chamber that Clark Subic become the next capital of the Philippines. And it becomes the IT centre of the Philippines, much like Silicon Valley in America. On jobs, I pointed out in my column on February 11 that jobs should be the #1 priority of all the presidentiables. That if you focus on jobs, everything else follows. I won't go through the list, but basically, to get a job, you have to be healthy. So healthcare is important. To get a job, you have to be educated. So education is important. To get a job, you have to be able to get to work. So infrastructure is important. And I had a list of about 8 other items, all of which focus around jobs. So jobs is perhaps the most important thing we can focus on today. And when we look at jobs, we have to look at the reality, and government doesn't look at the reality. this government says that we are better today because fewer people are without a job. That is not true. Because we're talking people, not percentages. We are growing at 1.9% population a year. The denominator is growing, so the percentage looks better, but the reality is worse. So when you look at the number of people without jobs, it's almost the same now as it was 5 years ago. Very little improvement at all. And if you take into account the change in definition that was made in 2003, then it's even worse. And if you take into account the 200,000 or so OFWs that would have liked to stay home with their families, the number is even worse again. So we have a very poor situation on the creation of jobs. And we need to give much higher priority to it. So I'd like to ask each of the panel now to give us their ideas on how we do create more jobs, what needs to be done. And can we start, I think, who should we start with? One of the ladies, I think. Yes. Yes. Can we start with you? Yeah. Janet? Yeah.
Good morning. I'm from the Mindanao Development Authority. It's actually a subnational agency created by law, essentially to integrate and coordinate the various development efforts in Mindanao, specifically those which are Mindanao-wide in nature, interregional, or those which have Mindanao-wide impact. So we also do policy advocacy, and we also act as the Philippine Coordinating Office for the Economic Cooperation under the ASEAN, the BIMPIAGA, or the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines East ASEAN Growth Area. I'm quite happy with the presentations of Secretary Luistro and Mr. Van den Brink on the jobs report, because essentially it captures also the employment and unemployment strategies for Mindanao. You have to have the critical elements. One, the enabling environment, which are already mentioned, transport, logistic infrastructure, access to credit. We need to have investments coming in, they create the jobs. And we need to ensure sustainability of the jobs. We need to have human resource capacities through education and skills development. All of these three combined, you create jobs. But in Mindanao, because we're positioning Mindanao to be the agribusiness, the agriculture and the agribusiness hub of the country, we are very particular about jobs created specifically targeting the agribusiness, agriculture sectors. Because a little over half of our people in Mindanao are very much dependent in agriculture. So in that way, we're already targeting the poorest of the poor in Mindanao. Mindanao's context is quite unique and a little bit interesting. Unique in the sense that, as mentioned by the World Bank Country Director, we suffered from decades of neglect. And so there's a lot of catching up to do. And this is not present in Luzon and in Visayas. Interesting in that, despite those years, those decades of neglect, and despite the extractive institutions that have been in Mindanao for so long, over the last couple of years, for the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen gradual transformation of the economic landscape in Mindanao. Let me cite very few examples. Number one, national attention has been poured in Mindanao for the past 5 years. Our budget, particularly for infrastructure, has been increased from only 150 billion share cumulative between 1997 to 2010. Over the last 4 to 5 years, we had 288 billion only for infrastructure. That's a stark contrast and a stark difference from many years before. Investments have been coming in as well. In the past, investors would shy away from Mindanao, but because of the many reforms that have been gradually put in place, we're happy with the gradual change of perception on Mindanao. With this, more jobs have been coming in. It's not yet the level, the ideal level that we expect or we target, but if you look at the baseline of where we were in the past, we are already happy at the pace that we're moving. Last year in 2015, Mindanao's unemployment rate was at 4.6%. It's a little lower than the Philippines' 6.3% unemployment. And in terms of numbers, because you said it's better if you look at individuals and numbers rather than percentages, between 2010 to 2014, an average of more than 9,000 individuals were employed. Again, that's not an ideal state, but if you look at where we were only getting around 5,000 in a year, new employed. For us, that's already a modest improvement. And now with the growing investments in agriculture, there are a lot of multinationals doing land banking already in Mindanao recently, and more on agribusiness investments discreetly coming in. We're happy with the thought that these can add more jobs, hopefully, in the next coming years. Overall, Mindanao has been growing faster even by the national level. In 2014, our growth rate was at 7.14%, a rate higher than the national growth of 5.7% in 2014. What makes it so interesting is the fact that 10 years, a decade ago, or 15 years ago, we were only growing at 2%, 3%, at most 7%. But now it's 7.5%. It's our first time, actually, for over decades. What's the message? The message is that Mindanao is so promising. It has a lot of agribusiness potentials that, given the right policy mix, given the right infrastructure and the right support, it can really push its growth levels higher and create more jobs for our people. But we know that that's not enough. We have just scratched the surface, and we need to do more. Particularly the top 3 cross-cutting issues that's hounding Mindanao at the moment, and I think this also came out in the World Bank report, is still on agriculture, the need for agriculture push. The lack of transport, power, and logistics, particularly rural infrastructure, if to cite a few, complex regulations, and overlapping policies on land ownership. We have had started modest accomplishments along this line. We have had one-stop facilitation center for renewable energy applications only in Mindanao, and now it's being replicated nationwide. We already instituting the development corridors, connecting rural farms to their gateways, to the markets, through infrastructure and logistics preparations.
Janet, I think we'll have to move along.
So in summary, let me end by saying that we're positioning Mindanao to be the agriculture and the agribusiness hub of the country. Therefore, the larger part of the support required would be more on rural infrastructure and, of course, providing incentives for investments to get into challenged and impoverished areas in Mindanao.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and good morning.
Thank you. Doris, I think we'd like to hear from you, and perhaps you'd just like to comment on shipping that Roger mentioned.
Thank you.
First.
Thank you, Peter. Before I comment on shipping, I just wanted to share. I had the privilege of chairing the APEC Business Council, and what I learned being in that position, going around the world talking to trade ministers, is that we have one thing that I think would propel all the change we're looking for. We need one change that would propel everything that Brother Armin has talked about, all these development goals, employment, and that is a mindset of strategic thinking. When I talk to the Mexican trade minister, the Australian trade minister, everyone speaks very strategically, very clearly about what direction they're aiming for, what industries are they focusing on. It is not an overall, let's grow. It's very specific, and it is also addressed, I think, at least from the surface, with an all-of-government approach. And I think this is a challenge that I think the next administration should really focus on. We have an opportunity today, after hosting APEC, to look very positively, to look very confidently at the future of this country, but with a very positive approach as to what it is that we're really selling to the world, what it is we want to excel in, and therefore put all the work in place. Education to make that work, infrastructure to make that work. Infrastructure, by the way, around clusters, so that we're not dealing with the problem of saying, you know, we need this, and then you think of it for the whole country, it's almost impossible to achieve. But if you talk about clustering areas and say, okay, this area, let's say Mindanao, the potential are in this sectors, it should even work into our promotions abroad. I mean, if we're going to go for mango abroad, we should have lobbyists everywhere. It should be a totally all-of-government approach. And I think that would inspire the kind of changes in education, very focused. I have to commend Brother Takriti Armin for the work he's done to put grade 12. He did this against all odds. The test they're trying to bridge. But you know, it's very hard for anyone to guess unless industry is there, unless industry is very actively telling you what you need. Even this idea of the European project that Ramon del Rosario and us are working on with the Philippine Business for Education, you know, you can say, great, let's make the high school students also work in a factory. But if the factory is not there, or if there's so few automotive factories, you need to massively cluster that. If we're determined to do it, we have to, by hook or crook, make that happen. And there are many ways to compare against the best competition. So I think well, agri for sure, and it has to be very specific, manufacturing very specific, trade and services very specific, SME. One of the goals we have now post-APEC is to take all our recommendations we made as chair to all the leaders and make them to our local industry. And our theme was inclusive growth. So one thing we want to do is really push for better governance on SMEs. We compete with a Malaysian SME corporation. We should have something not less than that, it should be better than that. And all of government approach to really bringing around an agenda to put more SMEs into global value chains, to get more SMEs into e-commerce, and to really understand where innovation can take place. And innovation is not by itself. Innovation is around the industries we excel in. Those are the ones that we, let's say we're going to go rice. I mean, Erie's here, they have all the R&D, and apparently we're the one who use it the least. So we need to be more focused, more targeted, more whatever. Now, going to the maritime industry, here is an example. In the trade and service sector with the NCC, I'm working with them on creating roadmaps. I'm pushing a roadmap on the maritime sector. It includes the labor sector, the domestic, the international, even the unions we brought in the shipbuilding sectors. We're trying to create this roadmap because we're the ones trying to connect. It's frustrating because the government's not talking to each other, so here we are trying to do this roadmap. The opportunity we have today is not only sending overseas workers. Today we're saying, listen, we can give you crew, but I'll manage your ship. I'm doing that now, and we're actually, the maritime manning sector is actually BPO, right? Because we're doing payroll, we're doing performance management, we're doing training. We're doing the highest level of BPO already. Brother, we need, you know, once you know this, we will give you a roadmap and it'll tell you exactly what education we need. And so I think I hope that we can leave this room with all of you looking positively to building a very confident Philippines around knowing what we want, what we're selling, where we want to go, and then work backwards into what impediments we have to lift and what education, what infrastructure we have to put in place. I think it's got to start with the head managing the tail. Thank you.
Thanks, Doris. Last year, foreign direct investment was $6.2 billion. Of that $6.2 billion, only $209 million was new manufacturing. That's hardly being able to create any jobs. Mr. Lee, would you like to say a few words?
Good morning. I'm Ho-Ik Lee of Korean Chamber. Korean Chamber in charge of tourism and medical care and retirement, which is a very simple sector of the 7 beginners. In 2015, Philippines earns $5 billion in tourism sector, and 5.3 million international tourists visit in the Philippines. And its shares of GDP to Philippines about 7.8%. Among the 5.3 million international tourists, Korean tourists can be covered 1.2 million, which is almost 25%. Is still number one. What we understand, Philippines has a very big advantage for tourism. Number one is geographical location, which is almost 3 hours by flight from Korea. Not only Korea, it's Japan and China, or even Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand, other Asian countries, which is the center of the tourism countries. And second thing is you have a very beautiful, geographical, the things like White Beach, and we always dream about coconut trees at the White Beach, something like that. And third thing is your people can speak English very well. So English is one of the main, point why Koreans visit here. But among that, even that, considering the other Asian countries, like when you see our report, like Thailand has 25 millions tourists, and Vietnam is almost 8 million, and the other, Malaysia is 28 millions. The Philippines is still far behind for the tourism, sector. So, which means you have a still big potential for the tourism. So I can say, there's some the challenge and improvement for the how to promote tourism sector. So number one is, I think, is a security issue. Security is one of the main topic among the Koreans. And second thing is infrastructure. Infrastructure means, the Pak Sang-han or the Tagaytay area is most of Koreans come to here, they visit there. It's kind of a mandatory, course. But before, Pak Sang-han is almost 1.5 hours is quite enough. But nowadays it's 4 hours, 3.5 hours driving. They are already exhausted when they come to the hotel. So which is not, suitable for the tourism sector. And the last thing is, your government need a more flexible policy. Let me ask one question. We Koreans come to here. What is the maximum amount of peso they can bring here? It's 10,000 peso. 10,000 peso. What is the maximum amount of US dollar they bring here? It's 10,000 US dollar. So what I know is, maybe American or European, there's no problem. Their, major currency is US dollar and euro, they can bring here. But we Koreans, we cannot bring the Korean one here because we cannot exchange here. So it means, they're going to exchange in Korea to peso. They can do that. But what is the maximum amount to allow? 10,000 peso. So this kind of policy, you need to change it. Otherwise, if they bring in more than 10,000 pesos, they easily, customs say that, they're just forfeiting. That's it, because it's illegal. So I need, my time is quite limited, so I will make short. So there's the three things: a security issue and infrastructure, and then more flexible government policy. This is what I ask at this forum. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was in Clark last week. I thought I needed a visa because I thought I was in Korea. I couldn't find a Philippine restaurant. They were all Korean. Dan, would you like to say a few words? We have a very short time left. But
just a few words on the BPO industry. There's no doubt of the success in sustainable employment growth that's delivered over the last couple of decades. We just need to make sure that we're not resting on our laurels in terms of the success or the success factors that enabled that growth in the last 20 years will not necessarily enable growth going forward. And we've heard some of these themes earlier, but that importance of investing in STEM education to enable the innovation that we expect in this industry over the next couple of decades, continuing to improve infrastructure, as we heard earlier, broadband being a very important aspect of that for the digitization and technological innovation to continue to grow, and then finally maintaining the kind of government support and improvements in bureaucracy that we laid out earlier this morning. So those are the key success factors for the growth to continue.
If I remember rightly, the speed here of the internet is 3.6 megabytes per second, and in Singapore it's something over 100. Slight difference. You didn't mention what I think is one of the more important things for the future, Department of ICT. Are you in favor of that? And what is your comment?
Yes, absolutely. I think as we think about the infrastructure and broadband and government policy coming together, having the DICT formed and operating, having a privacy commissioner in place as a multinational investing in the market, and in order for that industry to grow, we think that's a very important component. Yes.
And what about my idea of having an IT center where we had the colleges, the universities, the BPO sector, the manufacturing companies, all together in one area, as you do in Silicon Valley or in Bangalore?
I can see the merit to that. That's not something that we're focusing on, but I can see the merit, yes.
Okay, I think we have run out of time. It's been a very interesting session. I think what we've come out of this very clearly is the importance of jobs and the need for the next administration to put much more focus on the creation of those jobs, to recognize that we're at the moment well behind in giving people a good enough job. And as Roger said, it's not just unemployment, or the Secretary, it's underemployment, which is probably as important, if not more so, than people without a job as those with insufficient. And keep in mind, in agriculture, an awful lot of those jobs are no pay at all. They're family working on the farm and not being paid for it. Yet they're counted as jobs, and that's also an error in the statistics that has to be addressed. So thank you all for the session today. I think it was the most important one, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much to our panelists. May we please ask them to pose for a souvenir photo. In the meantime, we'd like to inform our guests that lunch will be served at your tables. If you have requested for a special dietary meal, please advise the waiters. We will also give you a 5-minute break between this session and the next in case you would like to visit the restrooms.